Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Council's final member update for 2017. I'm Janelle Carter-Brevard, Vice President of Communications. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few quick housekeeping points. Within the webinar, each of you should have a copy of the slide presentation. Please use that to follow along. For those of you who are watching the webinar, you can click and drag the border between the video feed and the slides to customize your viewing. Additionally, there's a help option in the toolbar of your navigation panel should you need assistance. There's also a questions box. We'll open the call for questions for Vicki or Hadar at the end of the presentation. And finally, I'd like to remind you that this webinar and the accompanying slides will be made available after the call for our members. We're happy to have you join us as the Council shares an update on the sector, what's going on at the Council, and of course, the recently released tax bill. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vicki Spruill, President and CEO of the Council on Foundations. Vicki?
Thanks so much for joining us for this final Council member update of 2017. I know this is a very busy time of year, and I appreciate you joining us here today. Our goal for these updates is to complement our ongoing communications with an inside look into our key programs and initiatives. We want to give you an overview of public policy efforts underway on Capitol Hill, and we want to share with you the Council's perspective on the ongoing challenges and opportunities facing philanthropy. It's our hope that through these calls, our members can get a better understanding of the work we're doing in three key areas. First, to amplify the important work being done by all of you. Second, to strengthen the field through professional development, convenings, and research. And third, to advocate on behalf of the sector. We believe that by focusing on these three areas, we can further the understanding of the value and role of philanthropy in a rapidly changing and complicated world. And I think we all agree that the charitable sector has faced some significant challenges this year. And I'll speak about some of those shortly. But through it all, I am constantly encouraged by the commitment of those in our sector and inspired by those who stand strongly for our core values. Our members turn these values into programs and partnerships that make life better for so many, and all of us at the Council want to thank you for that. I'd like to start with some good news. I recently returned from San Diego to celebrate the graduation of a new cohort of leaders who had just completed the 2017 Career Pathways program. For those of you who don't know, Career Pathways is the Council's flagship leadership development program. Its specific goal is to increase the number of candidates from diverse backgrounds into philanthropy's leadership pipeline. Over the last year, I got to know this year's class. They're each extraordinary, and they're more than capable to lead our field for the next generation. I cannot wait to see what they do and where they go. Speaking of people who stand out in our sector, last month we awarded the 2017 Robert W. Scribner Award for Creative Grantmaking to Noah Atencio. Noah is the Vice President of Community Impact at Community First Foundation in Arvada, Colorado. Noah received the award during a luncheon that was generously hosted by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He received the award for his leadership in the creation and promotion of something called the Innovators Society, which funds promising but not yet proven approaches to mental wellness, certainly timely. As this year's Scribner winner, Noah received a beautiful specially commissioned sculpture and a $10,000 prize. All of us are so proud of Noah and the work he's doing, as well as all the other nominees for the Scribner Award. So if you didn't apply this year, I hope you'll consider applying next year and sharing your story of innovation and creative grantmaking. I was also pleased to spend time recently in New York during the 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly, or UNGA, as we call it. Council staff hosted, presented at, and attended several events focused on the role of philanthropy in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and supporting global development. As part of Concordia's UNGA Summit, I was fortunate to moderate a plenary session focused on the role of U.S. philanthropy in international development. I was joined by Walmart Foundation President and Council Board Member Kathleen McLaughlin, the Rockefeller Foundation President, Dr. Raj Shah, and David Seamus, the President of the Obama Foundation. Together, this group discussed the ways foundations are collaborating across sectors to drive change globally, from Walmart's work to improve the livelihoods of women in the global supply chain, the Obama Foundation's work to increase civic engagement and trust, and Rockefeller's work on improving access to energy for millions around the world. Over the past 2 years, the Council has convened more than 350 foundations in 6 cities to discuss how the SDGs are relevant to domestic challenges in the United States. We're excited to continue working with local partners to strengthen the role of philanthropy in achieving the SDGs here in the U.S. And so if you're not yet engaged in our efforts, I hope you'll join us. I mentioned earlier that our sector has faced many challenges in recent months, and I've been especially inspired by the way philanthropy has seized the initiative to help those communities that have been affected by a variety of challenges. First, there was Charlottesville, which highlighted a disturbing trend of racial polarization in our country. Then came a series of natural disasters. We watched in horror as hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria wreaked havoc on Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Then there were the deadly earthquakes in Mexico, the devastating fires that ravaged entire cities in California, and then mass shootings in Las Vegas, and again this past weekend at a church in Texas. Following many of these tragedies, the Council has partnered with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy to host information sharing calls so that our members who've been struck by disasters in the past can share their experiences and best practices. We've also updated our website with many resources for people and foundations wanting help. I'd like to share just one example of how the Council has successfully connected philanthropic resources in these disasters. As you all know, much of Puerto Rico remains without water and power, which has made day-to-day life there a challenge. Well, just recently, the Council was able to connect the Community Foundation of Louisville with leaders at the Community Foundation of Puerto Rico. Louisville leaders were able to put them in touch with Water Step International, a Louisville nonprofit. And because of these connections, Water Step International is now on the ground providing invaluable water systems in Puerto Rico. This is just one way the Council has served as a resource and as a facilitator in these challenging times. We've also put out a call to collect stories and experiences about what's happening in Puerto Rico. We want to know, how is your organization providing support in this time of need? And what are you seeing and hearing on the ground? What are your grantees seeing and hearing? I'd like to make a personal request that you please consider sharing your stories by emailing cofcommunications@cof.org. When I talked earlier about strengthening the sector, I'm particularly proud of the work our Council team does throughout the year to develop quality programming with a range of philanthropic leaders who share their experiences and expertise with us. In October, we held our 3rd annual Endowments and Finance Summit in New York. The summit's rich discussions ranged from plenaries that examined domestic and global economic trends to insightful sessions on topics ranging from spending and investment policies to the brave new world of cryptocurrency and blockchain. Attendees tell us they were fully engaged and exposed to interesting and multiple viewpoints that they might not have otherwise had. We also have a number of events coming up in the next few months that I'd like to bring to your attention. Beginning this Thursday at Duke University in North Carolina, we're convening key leaders from the higher education, philanthropic, and private sectors to address the impact of implicit bias on leadership and operational excellence. We plan to release a paper early next year on the key outcomes of this convening, which, by the way, is in partnership with the TIAA Institute and Duke University. So please be on the lookout for that. Later this month, on November 29th and 30th in San Diego, our Veterans Philanthropy Exchange will gather to tackle the issue of veterans employment. We're delighted to be working with the San Diego Grantmakers and their Military Family Readiness Working Group in planning the programming and the community reception at the USS Midway Museum. On December 5th and 6th, we're holding our CEO and trustee retreat in Miami, Florida. This retreat is a unique opportunity to bring together foundation CEOs and members of their respective boards to engage in challenging dialogues that we hope will strengthen their relationships and enhance their effectiveness. And finally, the Council will co-host the first North American Community Foundation Summit on February 5th and 6th in Mexico City in partnership with peer philanthropy networks in Mexico and in Canada. This two-day convening will provide opportunities for learning from Community Foundation peers around challenges like immigration, economic development, climate change, and education, and how these challenges link to the vital role community foundations play in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you can see, we have a number of things underway that amplify the great work the sector is doing, that advocates on behalf of the sector, and that strengthens the sector. And speaking of advocating for the sector, that's a perfect intro for our Senior Vice President for Government Relations, Hadar Suskind. As I'm sure you've seen last week, the House of Representatives introduced tax reform legislation, which we firmly believe will harm our nation's culture of charitable giving. Hadar and the Council's expanded government relations team have been combing through and analyzing the legislation. He's here to give us an overview of the bill and to share our concerns and to let you know what you can do. So Hadar, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm going to take a few moments and talk us through where we are in the process of the tax bill, and then I'll dive into the specific provisions that are the priorities for the Council, and I know are priorities for many of you. So, as Vicki mentioned, the bill was introduced in the House Ways and Means Committee last Thursday by Chairman Brady. Since then, we've seen now two versions of a chairman's markup, basically updated versions of the bill that he's introduced. And the legislation is in its second day of markup or committee discussion that's ongoing right now. Much as we expected, the bill has been looked at pretty clearly across partisan lines, with Republican members largely supporting it and Democratic members offering questions and concerns. There are, however, a number of provisions in the bill that have raised bipartisan concern, and I'm going to touch on those briefly because while they're not our priorities as they don't relate to philanthropy, they are the provisions that are ultimately likely to decide whether or not this bill is going to pass the House. So first among them is the state and local tax provision, the SALT provisions. Under current law, people who itemize have the ability to take a deduction on their state and local taxes, both property taxes and income taxes. This bill eliminated the deduction for income taxes, which has raised concerns among many House Republicans who are in higher tax states, New York, New Jersey, and California in particular. There have also been concerns around eliminating the tax deduction for payments on interest on student loans, eliminating the adoption tax deduction, changing the level for the home mortgage interest deduction, and a number of other provisions that are still under consideration and frankly open for debate among the Republican caucus in the House. With that, I'm going to turn to where we are on the provisions that have been priorities for the Council and priorities for our field. So first and foremost, as expected, this bill does double the standard deduction, which would mean we would be going from approximately 33 million Americans who itemize on their taxes and get the benefit of the charitable deduction down to just about 5 million Americans. So that's a major, major concern, and that is the provision that really was at the heart of the Indiana Lilly School study from earlier this year that shows that if passed into law, this bill would lead to a decrease of approximately $13 billion in charitable giving every year. As you well know, the solution that we at the Council had offered to help mitigate that was the idea of a universal or above-the-line deduction. That language was not included in the original bill. It has not been included in the chairman's mark to date. We continue to work with the committee and we continue to work with Congressman Mark Walker, who introduced a bill that included language on the universal deduction, although with a cap of that benefit, in an effort to try to get that included into the bill. I think it's fair to say that we are pretty pessimistic about the likelihood of that being included in the House legislation, but that is an ongoing effort, and you never know which vote they're going to end up needing, so that's something we continue to work on. Along with that, there are the two long-term priorities of the Council, working to get the IRA rollover extended to donor-advised funds, and working to simplify the private foundation excise tax down to a flat 1% rate. So to take the donor-advised provision first, that language was not included in the House bill. There is some new reporting language for organizations that sponsor donor-advised funds. It is a softened version of the language that was in the Charity Act that we and others worked to get reintroduced in the Senate last year and introduced in the House, but does not include the rollover language. Again, we continue to work with Congressman Holding, who's been the champion on that issue in the House, to see if we can get it into the House bill and on the Senate side as well. On the private foundation excise tax, there is language in the bill that impacts that. Instead of the 2%, 1% variable language that exists under current law, what's been proposed is a flat 1.4% rate. That rate was scored by the Joint Committee on Taxation to raise $50 million in tax revenue per year, or $500 million over the 10-year life of the bill. So it does have, and that $50 million, to be clear, is tax that they would anticipate getting from private foundations per year. So it has the negative of that cost. It does have the positive of taking away the variable rate and giving us consistency so that all foundations would know very clearly what the tax rate is that they're paying. We continue to work to fight to get the 1% rate, or perhaps a revenue neutral rate, included in the House bill, working very closely with Congressman Eric Paulson, who's been the champion on that issue in the House. And again, like with all of these provisions, continue to work on those on the Senate side. In addition to that, another priority for the field and for us at the Council has been the Johnson Amendment language. There is the limited Johnson Amendment weakening language included in this. It is not the full repeal, but rather the language that would create a carve-out for, as it says in the bill, churches. The tax language that it refers to, the section of the code, refers to more broadly faith-based organizations. So there's some ambiguity around the language, although it's generally believed that it would apply to all faith-based organizations broadly. Interestingly, on that provision, the Joint Committee on Taxation put a $2.1 billion cost on the 10-year implementation of this. And Congressman John Lewis, in yesterday's markup, asked the head of the Joint Committee what exactly makes up that $2.1 billion cost. And the answer was that they anticipate that approximately $8 billion in funding over 10 years, so approximately $800 million a year, that had been given into political advocacy work, gone directly to candidates or campaigns or non-tax deductible entities, would now go into these churches and faith-based organizations because of the weakening of the Johnson Amendment. And the $2.1 billion is the tax loss that would apply because of that. So to questions around that, the Joint Committee itself is anticipating a great deal of money going into that process. So those are the primary provisions of importance for us and for the sector. There are a number of other pieces in there that I want to mention. One, the Newman's Own provision was included in there. There is also a positive piece in there that would raise the AGI limits currently that are set at 50% up to a 60%. So for those who have higher assets and perhaps lower income and have been stymied by that 50% limit, there would be an increase there, which would certainly be a positive. Other provisions of notice in the bill, there is a new tax on university endowments set at a 1.4%. That would apply to any private universities that have at least $250,000 worth of endowment per student, which limits that to a relatively small number of Ivy League and other high endowment universities. The Council, since we do not represent universities, have not taken a position explicitly on that bill, but we have been following that very closely and working closely with the members of Congress who had introduced that and supported that. to make very clear the separation and the differences between university endowments and foundation endowments, but that's another piece of notice to follow. From there, I want to go back to the process for just a minute. We are anticipating another day of markup tomorrow, and then a vote coming possibly as early as tomorrow night or Thursday in the House Ways and Means Committee. Again, they are still adding provisions to the bill. They are at the moment not accepting Republican amendments, but Democrats are offering amendments, and they're still making changes through the chairman's process on the Republican side. So the expectation is that the bill will pass out of committee, although of course it remains to be seen. And that would set up timing for a vote on the House floor next week. We're also anticipating now, to jump to the Senate side, the introduction or the release of language by the Senate Finance Committee and Chairman Hatch next week. Our understanding is that it will be detailed language, but not in legislative text language, and that they will probably wait for the vote on the House floor and then refine their language and go through their committee process there. There have been suggestions that they're going to try to get that bill marked up and out of the Finance Committee and voted on the floor in early December, but Chairman Hatch has wavered on that timeline, so that remains to be seen a little bit. All of the provisions that we mentioned on the House floor, the positive and the negative on the House side, are under consideration one way or another in the Senate Finance Committee. We continue to be in very close touch with them, discussing options around an above-the-line or universal deduction, looking at the private foundation excise tax and whether we can get to that 1% or a revenue-neutral number, attempting to get the IRA rollover to donor-advised fund language include, hoping to pull out the Johnson Amendment weakening language, and the rest of those provisions that we mentioned as well. So that is where we are on tax reform and the legislative process at the moment. And with that, I think we want to open to questions. I think we're going to hand it back to Vicki.
Thanks, Siddharth. I hope you all are getting ready with your questions. We've covered a lot of topics today, and I hope it's been helpful, and I hope this encourages you to find ways to further engage with us at the Council. Just a quick reminder, the member renewal period has officially kicked off, and I'm happy to share that there will be no dues increases this year. April 30th, 2018 is the renewal deadline. So as always, our membership team is available to answer all your questions, and we sincerely thank you for your membership. It is a real privilege to call you our members and to work together on behalf of philanthropy, especially at this critical moment. I'm very optimistic about the future of our sector, especially in challenging times like these, and I sincerely believe that working together, leading together, philanthropy is a powerful force for good that can advance civil rights and strengthen democracy and preserve our planet and position our communities for future growth. And now we're happy to take any questions you might have.
While we're waiting for those questions, I just want to add in that you'll be getting further analysis on the legislation and a call to action from us in Snapshot this Thursday. It is definitely our view that as of right now, we do not support this bill and we would actively oppose it. If we can get the provisions of the relevant provisions amended and added in, we might change that position, but at the moment this bill would definitely be a net negative for our sector overall, and so we are actively opposing it.
We have one question to start things off. What percentage chance do you think that tax reform has of actually passing?
That's the big question.
We're just jumping right to the end, aren't we?
Yeah.
That is the magic number, and you know, I don't think it's that useful to necessarily put a number on it, but I'll give it a go here, which is I think we are quite likely to see something pass the House committee. I'm quite likely to see something pass the House floor. It may yet, in fact, it almost certainly will be further amended from where it is, most likely around the state and local tax provisions, the home mortgage provision, and a few of those other issues. But I think that they will likely have the votes in the House and will pass that bill and send something on to the Senate. The Senate is going to be where the big challenge is. The votes are tighter there, and there's less There's a different process that makes it a little bit more challenging. So, but I will say that we have heard from every office we've spoken to, Republicans and Democrats, that there is an incredibly strong sense of urgency among the Republican majority to pass a bill, and that even if it is not the bill as they ideally want to see it, that they feel a great urgency to get something passed and get it passed soon. And so the likelihood is that if they have to, for instance, tweak a number of things in the Senate in order to get enough votes there, that the House would be likely to take that Senate bill back and pass it. So I think there is a real chance that this bill gets passed.
We have another question here. What do you think will be the biggest difference between the House version and the Senate version?
Well, the one that I would say is most likely to be particularly relevant to our sector, and in fact, thank you for this question, because I forgot to mention this provision, is possibly around the estate tax. Currently in the House, the legislation would double the limit, the value at which people are assessed the estate tax. So it would have the number of families or individuals who would pay the estate tax, and then after a 6-year period would phase it out entirely. The elimination of the estate tax has been a very core central component of Republican tax policy for years, and was certainly expected to be in any bill. We've heard that there are a number of Senate Republicans who don't want to see that provision included, and so if I had to guess, I think that provision is less likely to pass the Senate, and that may be a good example of one of those provisions that is included and passed in the House bill, but not in the Senate bill. So I think as it comes to areas of importance for us, that would be one of them. I hope that there are some other areas. I hope we can get the IRA rollover included in the Senate. I hope that we can get the private foundation excise tax number lowered, and perhaps some kind of above the line deduction. But I think the most likely would be the estate tax piece.
Someone just emailed and asked, what do you need members to do with regard to the tax reform issue?
Whoever that is, thank you so very much.
Yes, echo that.
Yes. So again, you will be getting more information and a call to action from us in Snapshot on Thursday, and then a follow-up next week as well. But what we need members to do right now is reach out to your elected officials. Reach out to your House members and tell them that you are opposing the bill as it is currently written. If you have elected officials who are on the Ways and Means Committee, we'd want you to reach out to them and specifically urge them to include a universal deduction, to include, to fix the private foundation excise tax piece, and to make sure that, they understand fully the consequences of what it means to go from 33 million people who are itemizing to 5 million people who are itemizing, that we're going to lose $13 billion in charitable giving. So if you need help either finding out who your members of Congress are or figuring out how to identify them or reach out to them, or you're looking for talking points and information, please reach out to me and my team. And then next week, we're going to be urging people, again, to reach out to all members of the House and urge them to oppose the bill until and unless these changes are made, and likewise to the Senate Finance Committee. And I do want to note that all of our members, whether you are a corporate foundation, a community foundation, or a private foundation, can do this, that taking a position on the bill is very clearly, we've spoken with our legal team here, very clearly covered under the self-defense provision.
I think that was our last question. I want to encourage anyone with any additional questions to reach out to us at cofcommunications@cof.org. We are committed to answering those questions by email, so simply direct them to us. And thank you again for joining us.